Imagine when America achieved independence by beating the Brits at Yorktown. Imagine if instead of the wise founding fathers getting together and creating a republic run by people like Madison and Washington, imagine if you put Aaron Burr in charge. That's kind of what happened to Britain after Brexit. We put a bunch of charlatans in charge.
Hello. Welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on someone who knows a lot about free markets, knows a lot about what's happening in Mississippi, and knows about even the parliament and things that he's done overseas. So it's none other than Doug Carswell. Doug, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Vance, thank you for having me on. It's wonderful to talk to you.
It really is, and it's a pleasure. We've known each other for a while now. I've done some work together, and you're really doing a lot of great work, so it's a pleasure to have you on. But before we get into all the fun stuff, Doug, let me go ahead and give the audience your background, and then we'll jump right into it. So, Doug was appointed president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy in January 2021. In 2022, the State Policy Network awarded Mississippi Center for Public Policy the biggest win for freedom award for securing historic tax cuts. Douglas was twice voted for a spectator parliamentarian of the year in Britain, non-executive director of the UK Department of International Trade since 2020. During that time, the UK has successfully secured multiple free trade agreements around the world. Doug received a BA with honors, a degree in history at the University of East Anglia before reading for his master's degree at King's College, University of London. Raised in Uganda, Doug is now settled in Mississippi with his wife, a young daughter, and Crumble, the dog. Got to make sure we mention the dog in there. That's right.
Quite.
So with all that stuff, Doug, we've got a lot to talk about today. But let me start with this first, like I do all my guests. Why do you do what you do every day?
I believe in liberty. Liberty is the secret ingredient for human success. It's what has lifted our species from the swamp to the stars, to use a phrase Ronald Reagan once said. And if you have liberty, nothing is impossible. If you don't have liberty, life becomes pretty grim and you revert back to living in mud huts. So liberty is why I do what I do. And I think I have the best job in the world. I believe in liberty. I get to do fun things. I get paid to do something I care passionately about. I look forward to Sunday evenings because I've got the week ahead of me. It's a privilege to do what I do.
That's fantastic, Doug. And you've been doing it for, a great job at it. There's been a lot of things to go through. I wonder kind of you with your background and being in Britain and doing the things there and now in Mississippi and growing up in Uganda and things of that nature. What gave you this liberty mindset? Was it something that you read, something that you just lived through the process? What was it for you?
I grew up in a small republic in the middle of Africa that was run by a dictator, an infamous dictator called Idi Amin. And long before I knew the word economy or economics, I could see with the evidence of my own eyes what happens when government becomes all powerful. Around me, there would be small farmers who would grow coffee as a cash crop. Then, of course, the president decreed that only he could buy and sell coffee and that everyone had to sell to him. Guess what happened? People stopped producing coffee. I could see what price controls would do. I could see what would happen if you controlled economic activity. A country that was incredibly rich in natural resources became dirt poor. And I think that had a profound impact on me. I could see that, the descent into barbarism and savagery is only a few big public policy errors away. If you allow people to take power and to take control of the economy and run it in the interests of a small parasitic elite, you become dirt poor. If you get rid of that system and you allow people freedom, and this is the great success story of Uganda. Uganda is a thriving and prosperous place. They've got 6% annual economic growth for the past 30 years. Why? Because they're economically pretty free. So I think, from a very, very, very early age, I saw the positive effects of liberty and the damaging effects of tyranny. Wow. It was real to me in a way that it never is when you're just reading textbooks or Ayn Rand. I sometimes feel that my early childhood could have been a chapter of an Ayn Rand novel. Yeah. So I think I was bound to be pretty libertarian.
Wow. I'd like to dig into that just a little bit more, Doug, because I mean, I've never been to Uganda. I've never been in a situation like that. And I think it's quite extraordinary of going through that. And I just wonder, you were young growing up there, but how are your parents and how are your family members, whoever was there? Were there any hardships that they went through that you noticed?
Well, there was a war going on, and there was a genocide going on, and unfortunately, you couldn't not notice some of that from time to time. There were repeated sort of coups where one group of soldiers would take over. There were repeated invasions. In fact, my first ever memory was of July 4th, 1976. Now, I remember that not because it was America's 200th birthday, although it was. At the time, I'm ashamed to say I didn't even know what America was, but that happened to be the day when the Entebbe raid happened, when Israel came and famously rescued Israeli civilians and other civilians that were being held by terrorists at Entebbe airport, the day of the Entebbe raid. And as a small child, I think it was probably my first ever memory, the morning of the Entebbe raid. I remember it vividly. So there were occasions like that. My father was a surgeon. My mother was a doctor. They were very busy. They ran a hospital out there. So, one got to see some of the more dramatic moments in Uganda's history. But actually, I wouldn't want people to think that my childhood was dominated by that. It was a wonderful environment to grow up in. I had a great interest in natural history and the outdoors. My mother was a leading ornithologist. So, I have very, very happy memories of my childhood. But yeah, there was this constant rumble of sometimes quite literally of fighting in the background.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you made it, and I'm glad, and everything, because that's an extraordinary situation to be in, but learning from and being able to explain to others kind of the hardships that people go through in places across the globe that many people don't experience. And I think sometimes, just real quick, Doug, I think sometimes that we overlook that. We take for granted where we're at now, to not understand the situations where people go through like you have.
Absolutely. I mean, since I started living in the West, I have this incredible appreciation of what's around me. I mean, I literally grew up in a country where there were not working telephones. I still, every time I use one of these, think it's a minor miracle.
And he's holding up a cell phone for those who can't see.
Yeah. The Western, I think my background growing up in Uganda convinced me that the Western way of life is the best way of life, because it has the maximum liberty. And I'm not a cultural relativist. I think the great affliction of Western thought at the moment is this idea of cultural relativism. And my own lived experience tells me that cultural relativism is nonsense. Some ways of life are better than others. And someone who didn't used to live in the West, having come to the West, I recognize that why people would want to live as Westerners. To be American is to have won first prize in God's lottery of life. And there are many people around the planet who want that ticket. Yep. It's understandable.
Yep. So when did you move to the West? What did you first go to Britain?
I first started going to boarding school in England when I was 13. Quite a sobering experience, coming across snow for the first time. And I remember the first time I ever used a paying telephone. It was quite an innovation that you put money in this machine and you could talk to someone. But on a serious note, I only really came to America, I think, for the first time in, I think it was 1988, 89. And weirdly, I felt I'd come home. Yeah. I suddenly no longer felt that I was the outlier in terms of my outlook on the world. I suddenly felt that I was in a place I had always meant to be in. It was quite an odd experience to come to somewhere where everything is, on the one hand, so unfamiliar, but the norms around you just seemed so me. I then did a stint in Britain. I was a member of Parliament in Britain for a number of years. I made the mistake of thinking that you could achieve maximum liberty by being in a legislature. And in being in a parliament, I realized I was actually in the wrong place. If you really want to maximize liberty, you need to be way upstream from elected politics. And that's why after being in the British Parliament for 12 years. I never lost an election, but I stood down having helped achieve Brexit. And I realized I wanted to then work for a think tank in the American South. And that's what I'm doing.
Quite extraordinary, Doug, to say the least. What about that though with Brexit? What was your how were you involved? What were some of the things that you were doing during that time?
I stood for election in Britain. One of the reasons I stood was to get Britain out of the European Union. If you believe that liberty is a good thing, then you cannot be in favor of the European Union. The European Union is a sort of parasitic, it's a sort of United Nations, but for Europe. It creates a sort of supplicant class of citizens and a small administrative elite who regulate and are regulating Europe into the history books. If you think that the European Union is a good idea, ask yourself, since the creation of the European Union, where is European innovation? Europe has only managed to lead the world in terms of debt and unassimilated immigration in the past 20 or 30 years. Europe is a basket case and a failure because of the European Union. So it struck me as imperative that my country, the United Kingdom, should leave the European Union, hopefully to save herself by leaving the European Union and hopefully to save the European Union by her example. So I stood for Parliament in 2005 on an express pledge to campaign for Britain to leave the European Union. I got in by a very wafer-thin majority. I then increased that majority in subsequent elections. I then left the official British Conservative Party to join Nigel Farage's upstart party called UKIP at the time. And I famously called a special election against myself because I felt that if I was changing sides, I owed it to my electorate to approve that decision, a sort of confirmation hearing of the public, if you like. I then became the first elected UKIP MP ever. I co-founded Vote Leave, the official Brexit campaign. We then won that campaign. I then decided to leave British politics because I thought that the establishment in Britain would have got the message. I thought Brexit would have been the ultimate wake-up call. Sadly, no. Nigel has had to reform the band, if you like. And actually, Nigel was recently elected in the very constituency that I represented in Parliament, which is fascinating. Wow. He's a great friend of Donald Trump, and I think on both sides of the Atlantic they're leading an insurgency against the establishments on either side. It's fascinating.
It really is. And how do you think that everything's turned out since Brexit and they left?
It's a story of horrifically wasted opportunities by a conservative establishment in Britain that really are in the tradition of Rockefeller Republicans. The leaving the European Union ought to have allowed British Conservatives to introduce a low-tax, deregulatory model to make Britain, rather like Singapore, competitive, high on human capital, a place lots of people wanted to go to, but we ought to be very selective in who we let in, like Singapore. Unfortunately, what happened after the Brexit result is that a series of catastrophic errors were made. Number one, the Conservatives, having won a massive majority 5 years ago, the largest majority the Conservatives in Britain have had since the days of Margaret Thatcher, failed to use that majority to establish their control over the administrative state. Having failed to control the administrative state, they ended up being controlled by the administrative state, notably during COVID, where they made their first massive economic blunder with a draconian lockdown. Worse than anything you've seen in even California. The British lockdown has bankrupted the country. When you pay people to be economically inactive at home for a long period of time, guess what? It costs a lot of money to pay them to be economically inactive, and many of them remain economically inactive. Britain's per capita GDP and productivity growth has taken a nosedive since the lockdowns. Weirdly, Boris Johnson doubled down on this idea of green energy with catastrophic consequences, making Britain not energy dependent, but energy dependent on other countries. High energy costs basically mean that the British economy has priced itself out of the world's markets. A lot of industry has closed down. The cost of living has gone up. Living standards have fallen as a consequence because of green energy. In order to try to offset the consequences of their own goals of lockdown and high energy costs, the British Conservatives then made two catastrophic economic mistakes. Number one, they printed lots of money, believing that would stimulate economic growth, similar to what happened in the United States. It instead led to inflation, which made a lot of middle-class people feel a lot poorer. Again, living standards fell. And then the fourth and final blunder by the British Conservative Party, they, to try to stimulate economic growth, had an open door approach to immigration. They allowed in literally millions of people. 1 in 30 people living in the United Kingdom at the moment has arrived in the past 2 years. But rather than being selective and allowing immigration from high capital populations who are culturally compatible with the United Kingdom, they allowed in low-skilled workers, often non-workers from around the world. This has lowered Britain's per capita GDP and created all sorts of problems of cultural incompatibility. So having made those 4 catastrophic errors, the British Conservative Party, which ought to have managed the country properly after Brexit, has basically handed a left-wing government a massive majority. It's almost, if I could put it this way, imagine when America achieved independence by beating the Brits at Yorktown. Imagine if instead of the wise founding fathers getting together and creating a republic run by people like Madison and Washington, imagine if you put Aaron Burr in charge. That's kind of what happened to Britain after Brexit. We put a bunch of charlatans in charge.
Ouch. Well, no, that's very telling, and it's helpful for me to understand kind of what's going on there as well, because I was interested to know, what happened after Brexit and, this huge rise of the Labour Party coming in. So, and to your credit, of getting that started back away in 2005. That was very revolutionary. And in that sense, I mean, even Milton Friedman, right? He always said that the EU wouldn't exist, especially since they had a centralized banking system and all these different fiscal policies across Europe, that it was bound to fail at some point when you had that sort of centralized government. And so I think you saw that early on as well. So let's move on to Mississippi. You came to America. You took this idea that you want to go to think tanks and be a little bit more upstream from the politics and making things happen. And you've been able to do that in Mississippi. And I like how you compare Mississippi with a lot of your writings with what's happening in Europe or some other places. But here recently, Mississippi's really been taking off and doing more pro-growth measures of tax reform and tax relief and everything else. And I just wanted to get your perspective on what's happening in Mississippi.
I mean, look at the big picture. The southern US is a tremendous success story. If you look over the past 30 or 40 years, you've seen a dramatic transformation. Businesses have started to move away from the traditional business clusters of New York and Chicago and California, and they're moving south. Only the other day, we heard that Elon Musk was moving Twitter's headquarters from California to Texas. He's moving, I can't remember the name of the company that builds his rockets, but their headquarters is moving.
SpaceX.
And it's not just SpaceX and Twitter. No. Businesses around America, capital and human capital and business are moving from the Northeast and the Midwest and the West Coast to the southern US. Why is this? It's because southern states are generally run along fairly conservative principles. They have generally low taxes, low regulation. They're attractive to business. A cynic might say that part of the southern success story owes a lot to, air conditioning and airports. And there's some truth in that. Air conditioning and aviation have meant that the South over the past 30 or 40 years has been more open to people from outside. But make no mistake, the conservative administrations of southern states explain why SEC states are doing phenomenally well. It's always puzzled me, though, that as Atlanta and Tennessee and Texas and Florida prosper, and almost all the job growth in America since COVID has happened in those southern states, there's one state right in the middle of the South that's been missing out on this, and that's Mississippi. Mississippi has been 50th out of 50 in far too many measures for far too long. So it seems to me that if Mississippi was to remove some of the restrictions that have been holding the state back, some of the good old boy cartel restrictions that regulate the economy, some of the high taxes, if we could just get rid of some of that, we would catch up. And I think that is starting to happen. We're starting to see Mississippi become part of the Southern success story. For the first time in as long as anyone can remember, Mississippi is now gaining population rather than losing population. We're not yet growing as fast as we need to be, but the decline has stopped. We're beginning to see some real economic growth, a lot of big inward investment. Amazon recently announced a $10 billion investment right here at the heart of Mississippi. Our university towns are growing incredibly fast. This growth is because Mississippi is starting to implement conservative low-tax deregulation policies. And I can talk you through some of the specifics of that.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great because you're right. You have this situation where there's a lot of growth in the South. I'm in Texas, so I see a lot of that growth, and in Florida and Tennessee. Louisiana has also been kind of one of the laggards as well with Mississippi, but I'm hopeful with their new governor, that Governor Landry, that they can start making some directional path towards more prosperity. But I really would like to know more about the details of Mississippi because I think it's a good success story that other states hopefully will follow.
Yeah. I mean, I think our first big win was universal occupational licensing. Now, that might sound a bit of a mouthful and it might sound frightfully boring, and you might think, what is that? Well, basically, in Mississippi for years, you needed a permit to do pretty much anything. And guess what? The vested interest would make it difficult for someone to get permission to be certified as a hairdresser or a teacher or whatever it was, because they didn't want competition. Now, Mississippi passed a universal occupational licensing law, meaning that if you're certified in lots of different professions outside the state, you can come to Mississippi and automatically get a license to practice that profession. One of the consequences of that is it's put downward pressure on the local state regulators to make it easier for people in Mississippi to get certified. So, long story short, it has deregulated the labor market and is incrementally deregulating the labor market. Big win. Often overlooked, but having a dramatic effect. A second really significant moment was the decision to make a play to abolish the state income tax. Now, we're not there yet. We moved to a flat 4%, which is not as good as Tennessee's 0% or Texas's 0% or Florida's 0%. But a flat 4% is a lot better than where we were. It makes it a lot cheaper to hire people in Mississippi. It means that when you earn $100 as an employee, you get to keep a lot more of your money than was the case before. So it's put money in the pockets of families, and they spend that money more wisely than politicians do. And this is generating growth. So labor market deregulation, tax cuts, we're starting to see the consequence of this in Mississippi. But we're still not there yet. The biggie that we've failed to do, and it's a real failure, is to change education in Mississippi. So often when people look to move to a state, the first thing they say is, what are the local schools like? I was talking to a guy who runs a medium-sized regional bank in the South, and they said to me, they struggle to find managers to move to parts of Mississippi because the first question the manager faces when they go home to discuss it with their family is, what are the local schools like? We have to in Mississippi implement the school choice program that is now happening all around us. We need to give families the ability to control their share of public tax dollars. If we do that, that is the missing piece in our economic reform program. It's holding us back. We've made some strides, but we're not there yet. We need proper school choice here. 1 in 4 kids in Mississippi is routinely not showing up to school. 4 out of 10 fourth graders can't read properly. They're not even getting the basics. So I think we need to fix that. We need a school choice revolution in Mississippi if we're going to be part of the Southern success story.
Definitely. And there are 12 states now. So I think there's more competition within our system of federalism to bring about that. Just like in Texas, there's not school choice. Louisiana just passed school choice, so they're going to be ahead of us in this game. Florida, other states are doing this as well. So I think you're exactly right. And that's a system of competition that brings about better ideas and hopefully better policy along the way.
Yeah. It's hugely significant. Transform the education system through school choice, and it makes the state even more attractive to you.
And empowering parents and everything else. And at the same time, you're empowering parents by leaving more money in their pockets through tax cuts and everything else. What about the spending side? And I've worked on this some already, Doug, but, looking at strengthening, spending limits and spending restraint. And, I talk a lot about population growth plus inflation as a good measure of reining in government spending and using surplus dollars to bring down taxes like income taxes there on a path to zero. What has been the the push on the spending side in Mississippi the last couple of years?
Well, if you give politicians a budget surplus, they will always try to find new ways to squander it. The obvious thing to do when you've got a budget surplus is give people back more of their money, right? It's taxpayers' money. If you have a surplus, cut taxes. Unfortunately, in Mississippi, we do, however, have some unfunded liabilities. We've got a public employment retirement scheme, the so-called PERS scheme, and huge financial black hole in it. Little done to address that. And at some point, if we're not careful, if we don't address the public employment retirement scheme, you're going to have to inevitably start to raise taxes to plug the gap. I'm disappointed that, yes, we've had some tax cuts in Mississippi, but I'm afraid we still have some state leaders who think that their job is to find better ways of spending your tax dollars. And part of the problem has been that they've committed to not just one-off uses for that surplus, but recurring uses for that surplus. And if we're not careful, if we don't allocate that surplus for further tax cuts fairly soon, it means that even though you've got people running the state calling themselves Republican, they will basically spend money in a way that will inevitably shift the politics of the state in a more left-wing socialist big government direction. And that is a real fight that we're going to have. And just because you happen to hunt, just because your truck has the right sticker, it doesn't make you a conservative if you're spending money like Nancy Pelosi.
Amen. That's a great way to put it. Because a lot of states are doing that. It's not just Mississippi. It's one of the things that I've been working on with a lot of states now is kind of this responsible budget. What I hope is a revolution, kind of like this the school choice revolution. We've had this flat tax revolution across the states. And I think the next thing we really need is spending revolution, because you're exactly right, is that we've had a lot of surplus over the last few years, and Mississippi and other states have been putting in ongoing expenditures, which is going to make it difficult whenever those surpluses dry up. And I think some of that's happening now. I mean, Mississippi is growing, but there are some states that are starting to slow down quite a bit, given the bad economic policies of Biden, the Federal Reserve, a lot of things that are happening in DC, the overregulation that's going on. And if you look at the last few years, Doug, we've seen a lot of money that's been sent from the federal government to the states. Part of the CARES Act. Then you had the American Rescue Plan Act. Just a lot of money. And then we have the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got all these different acts that they're throwing more money at the states. And it's looking like a flood of money. Therefore, they can cut taxes. But if states don't take into account that these monies are one-time money that aren't going to come into the future, and if they don't cut taxes and deregulate and provide universal occupational licensure, like you mentioned earlier, in removing barriers to work, they're going to be a world of hurt, because we're already seeing what's happening in California. They went from a surplus to a massive deficit. Texas has fortunately been able to have a $30 billion surplus last time. They're looking at another $20 billion this time because of more conservative spending cycles. And so I think that this idea that you talked about of making sure that we're using every one of those taxpayer dollars wisely is going to be so important for the future. What else have you been seeing in that space there in Mississippi or across the country?
We all know that welfare dependency is bad, right? If a family becomes dependent upon welfare checks, it never ends well. They don't lift themselves out of poverty. They become more and more dependent upon a way of life that is just not productive. Now, if that applies for families, the same logic applies for states. Welfare dependency for states is a disaster. Mississippi has traditionally received more welfare handouts from the federal authorities in DC than any other state in America. Now, if welfare payments from DC made a state rich, we'd be the richest state in the union. But we're not. We're the poorest. Welfare is bad for states like it's bad for families. We need to wean ourselves off that model. Now, part of this is weaning ourselves off a political economy in Mississippi, where the success of politicians is measured by how much money they can siphon off from the feds. If you get lots of handouts to a state, you end up with lots of buildings named after lots of politicians, which is great for people who build buildings and great for the egos of those politicians. It's not great for the rest of the state. We need to wean ourselves away from those welfare handouts. And the key to doing that is, as you say, growth. Growth is the magic ingredient on all of this. Anyone who understands investing and the miracle of compound interest, well, the same logic applies for state budgets. If you want to know how you're going to plug the gap when the federal dollars dry up, which they will, and they need to, and if you look at the size of the federal debt ceiling in America, it's the sooner that dries up in a way, the better. How are states going to survive when that federal slush fund subsidy dries up? Growth. If you as a state prepare yourself for economic growth and achieve economic growth, you will achieve the miracle of compound interest for your state coffers. If you don't prepare the ground so that you can have that growth, you will not be in a good shape when that dries up. The key to this is growth. Now, deregulation is a relatively pain-free way of doing it. Get rid of the restrictions, get rid of the zoning laws, get rid of all the things that mean that an entrepreneur needs permission to do something. Do that and you will grow. Don't do that and enjoy the munificence of the Biden administration handing out all those welfare checks, and it'll be very, very painful when those checks dry up, which they will. But there are things that people can do about it. Mississippi has gone some way towards doing it, but we shouldn't measure Mississippi's success by how much we've deregulated compared to Mississippi 10 years ago. We need to compare ourselves to how deregulated we are compared to Tennessee, compared to Texas, because those are the states where the investment is going, and we need to deregulate and be as open to business as they are.
Yeah, well said, Doug. As usual, I think we're coming up with some good ideas, though, of like key pillars for economic growth that Mississippi and other states should follow. One is being sustainable budgeting and tax reform, removing barriers to work like occupational licensing and other factors that go into keeping people from working, including safety net reforms or welfare reforms, whatever you want to call it, because that incentivizes people not to work. And then school choice. I think those are really three key things that allow for people to prosper, let people prosper, the name of the show. But those are really key areas that I'm so glad that you're highlighting, because we need more of that across the country. And I've talked to a lot of people now, Doug, on just in general, but also on the show, where some have even said that regulation and deregulation is probably the biggest factor to growth. Yes, spending and taxes are important, but the regulations are hidden taxes, and they're stifling economic growth and prosperity in our daily lives that it's difficult for us to see. So just like you said, it was easier to remove that and have deregulation, it's also kind of easy to regulate things and put these little spigots or chains within the wheels of economic growth that we can have. And so I'm so glad you're bringing this up. What are some of the next steps that you're hopefully going to work on and get done in Mississippi?
Regulation is like the barnacles on the boat.
There you go.
You don't see them, but they stop the boat gliding smoothly through the water. And you often don't see them, you don't notice them. But as any keen yachtsman knows, if you let the barnacles on the boat build up, you suddenly can't really move anywhere. And that's what happens to economies. Now, the barnacles we really want to scratch off the boat in Mississippi, a lot of them concern the healthcare economy. Now, the healthcare economy is a really important part of any economy. Why? Because as people get richer, they want to invest more and more in their healthcare. And this is why, in prosperous states, the healthcare economy is a really important part of economic growth. Here in Mississippi, we've had a socialist system, and it is a socialist system, for 40 years. In order to expand healthcare or change the provision of healthcare in 19 different areas of healthcare, you need a permit. If I want to set up a company that competes and provides kidney dialysis treatment for people, or I want to set up a clinic that provides outpatient services for people, or I want to get an MRI scan and provide MRI facilities for people, I need a socialist type permit. And the people who issue the permit are the existing competitors. So guess what? You have a socialist permission-based system where the existing providers find ingenious ways of denying people a legal permit to compete with them. It would be a bit like, Papa John's needing to get a permit to open up a new restaurant from Pizza Hut.
Right.
And this matters. It's not just a healthcare issue. It doesn't just explain why healthcare outcomes in Mississippi are some of the worst in the country. It's an economic growth issue, because literally the healthcare economy in Mississippi cannot grow. and you start to see the consequences of this. So one of the barnacles we need to scrape off the Mississippi boat are the so-called certificate of need restrictions. These are con laws, certificate of need laws that create this cozy economic good old boy cartel. They're bad for healthcare. They're bad for the Mississippi economy. They're great. They're great for lobbyists who get huge kickbacks to try to kill any attempt to remove these hideous socialist laws. But they need to go. And frankly, we need to have an honest conversation. If you call yourself a Republican and you sit in the Mississippi state legislature and you support these socialist left-wing anti-growth laws, you need to be primaried. You need to go.
Yep. I totally agree. And so many more things that we could talk about and go into those directions. And it's really been a great conversation here today, Doug, as always. What would you like to leave the folks that are, legislators or influencers that are listening to the show? First of all, where could they find your information? Where's the best place to get with you? But also any other last words that you'd like to say before we go?
Well, the Mississippi Center for Public Policy is a sort of Reagan-type conservative think tank. We're optimistic. We are proud of not just Mississippi, but we're proud of America and what it means to be an American. You can tell from my accent that I'm not originally from Mississippi, but we believe as a think tank that there is no greater place in America than Mississippi. We exist to try to make sure that Mississippi is part of the American success story, part of the Southern success story. If you want to find out more about us, our website is mspolicy.org. That's mspolicy.org. And we'd love to hear from you. We are trying to create a mass movement in Mississippi for the kind of changes we need to lift our state up. We want to be more like Texas, more like Florida, more like Tennessee, and less like Chicago and the Northeast. We want to be part of this free market revolution.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to put all that in the show notes page as well. You're doing great work. Keep it going, Doug. I look forward to working with you on some of these issues as well. But God bless you and your family, Doug.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, and it's been a great discussion today. And for the audience, if you like this discussion, please leave us a 5-star rating. Share this with your friends and family, as every state needs more ways to have more economic growth and prosperity and to let people prosper, right? You can find all the show notes at vanceginn.substack.com or go to my website, vanceginn.com. I'll have that there as well. And until next time, let people prosper.